I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die. Hey!
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
After you've gone and left me crying, after you've gone, there's no denying you'll feel blue, you'll feel sad, you'll miss the dearest pal you ever had. There'll come a time, now don't forget it, there'll come a time when you'll regret it. Someday, when you grow lonely, your heart will break like mine, and you'll want me only. After you've gone, after you've gone away. There'll come a time, now don't forget it, there'll come a time when you'll regret it. Someday, when you grow lonely, your heart will break like mine, and you'll want me only. After you've gone, after you've gone away.
I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. They fly so high, nearly reach the sky, and in my dreams they'll fade and die. Fortune's always hiding. I've looked everywhere. I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. They fly so high, nearly reach the sky, and in my dreams they'll fade and die. Fortune's always hiding. I've looked every good where I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. I'm forever blowing bubbles, bubbles in the air. Fortune's always hiding away from me. I've looked everywhere, but I just keep on blowing bubbles. I'm forgetting all my little troubles. I'm forever, ever, and ever blowing bubbles in the air.
you gonna keep them away from harm? That's a mystery. Imagine Reuben when he meets his pa. He'll kiss his cheek and holler, ooh la la. How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Terry? Tell me, mother, how you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Terry? And how you gonna keep them away from Rector, dancing around and painting the town? Woo! How you gonna keep them away from harm? That's a mystery. They'll never want to see a rake or plow. And who the heck can parley-vous a cow? How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Terry?
Deep in my heart I hold for you one tender thought, so sweet and true. Nobody knows but this little rose I give you. Dear little rose with your heart of gold, dear little rose, may your petals fold my secret sweet. I will trust you to keep deep in your heart will repose. No one will know what your leaves conceal. No one will guess what they could reveal. You will know then that I love you, dear, when your
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin today with a song. Police Officer Stephen McNulty and Police Officer Kim Tavares have lent their voices to many civic, sports, and government events over the years. God bless America.
Land that I love,
Stand beside her
and guide her through the night with the light from above,
from the mountains
to the prairie,
to the oceans wide with foam.
God bless America.
My home, sweet home.
From the mountains
To the prairie,
to the oceans wide with foam. God bless America.
my home, sweet home.
God bless America.
My home, sweet home. We would like to welcome you today to UMass Boston. Our interim chancellor, Catherine Newman, has a few words to share with us.
Greetings and welcome to UMass Boston. My name is Catherine Newman, and I have the honor of being the interim chancellor of this distinguished university. I wish I could be with you today to commemorate the 1919 Boston police strike, which was a complex and deeply influential event with both local and national repercussions, and to celebrate the achievements of the remarkable team who have worked for 7 years to research the lives of the more than 1,100 strikers. The 1919 Boston Police Strike Project represents a collaboration between the Boston Police Department Archives and University Archives and Special Collections in the Joseph P. Healy Library here at UMass Boston. Their work reflects all the best of what a public research university can be, bringing together community volunteers, family members, UMass Boston staff, students, and faculty in a collective effort to explore and understand the past through rigorous archival research. In the process, they are creating a unique data set that will be available online to serve researchers, students, and family historians well into the future. The commemoration today of the 1919 Boston police strike is a significant milestone in this ongoing project. I would like to especially thank the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, who are commemorating the centennial of their own union history this week, and who provided significant support for today's event. This is a major contribution to public history, and we are all very proud of the work our librarians, archivists, historians, and volunteers have done to mark this momentous period in labor history. Again, welcome to you all, and enjoy the program.
On Monday, September 8th at 10 o'clock p.m., Union President John F. McGinnis addressed the newly formed Boston Policemen Union at Fay Hall. All were present except those on duty. At this 2019 centennial commemoration, Boston police officer and department historian Robert Anthony takes the stage to address the audience as the assembled officers in Fay Hall. The text is drawn almost entirely from a public statement that John F. McGinnis issued to the press on September 9, 1919.
Brother officers, what are the causes of the formation of this city's policemen's union? What are the roots of our affiliation with the American Federation of Labor? The first is the Boston Social Club and its benefits to the Boston Police Department. There is too much we have not received, owing to the throttle of the police headquarters, which was continually at the throat of progress. After 13 years, we came to the conclusion that the Boston Social Club was not a success. The men in bringing grievances that would result in material benefits for us were always throttled before they reached the commissioner. Next, the hours of labor. The only right we had under the law is 1 day off in every 15 days. And even then, we cannot leave the city limits without permission. We know how usefulness the patrolman delivering unpaid tax bills when it is the duty of a civilian employee. We know the uselessness of 15 men on duty at a Sunday band concert when 1 or 2 would do. Then there are the captains sending men in uniforms on errands to collect lunches, Sunday dinners, newspapers, etc., without even mention made of compensation. This duty is distasteful and much against a man's pride. Police captains making messenger boys out of officers instead of adopting the tactics of honest, grown-up policemen. The next issue we addressed is pay. We work no fewer than 83 hours per week, some of us as many as 98 hours per week, and we earn on an average of 25 cents an hour. And do not forget, we are forced to pay $207 out of that money that we earn to pay for our uniforms and equipment. We also protest the matter of promotions within the police department and the improper conditions of civil service examinations. Mr. Curtis reserved the right to disregard a man shown in a competitive examination and to promote another man whose name might be at the very bottom of that eligibility list. We consider this one of the most contemptible things which we now face. In one of the station's houses, where we live and where we work, some of them are good and perfectly sanitary. Others are unsanitary, and some are deplorable. For example, in Division 2, there is but 1 bathtub for 135 men and only 4 toilets. The vermin are so numerous in that station that the leather is eaten off the helmets. An investigation that was conducted in 1909 revealed these conditions, but no action was taken over these past 10 years. The reason given was the city could not afford to make the improvements. So on August 15th of 1919, right here in Fay Hall, we voted overwhelmingly to unionize and affiliate with the American Federation of Labor. Then Commissioner Curtis issued a general order forbidding officers from joining non-police organizations. And yesterday, he adjudicated 19 police officers, including myself, to be guilty of violating that order by joining a labor organization. Last night, he issued an order suspending the 19 of us of duty until sentences are imposed. The Policemen's Union was formed for the sole purpose of breaking the shackles and chains of bondage, now coupled so strongly about the hands and feet of police officers, that could only be brought about by our affiliation with the American Federation of Labor. In consequence, the city's police union, 16807, has once and all come to stay. Our union will exist and maintain its affiliation with the AFL as long as there is a policeman in Boston. We now have no choice but to fight for our right to unionize, to strike, until our union is recognized and our grievances are addressed. And so, I ask you now, brother officers, how do you vote?
On behalf of my father, Timothy J. Curtin, I vote yes.
On behalf of my grandfather, John G. Thompson, I vote yes.
On behalf of my great-grandfather, Malachi McGrath, I vote yes.
On behalf of my grandfather, John J. Cronin, I vote yes. On behalf of Charles Riley, I vote yes.
On behalf of my grandfather, Daniel Mayo, I vote yes.
On behalf of my great-uncle, James Francis Cripp, I vote yes.
On behalf of my grandfather, James Gillespie, I vote yes.
On behalf of my father, Dan O'Neill, I vote yes. On behalf of my great-uncle, Richard Murphy, I vote yes.
On behalf of my grandfather, Thomas Finn, I vote yes. On behalf of my great-grandfather, of Martin S. Cosgrove, our grandfather, we vote yes.
Yes. On behalf of my grandfather, Timothy J. Curtin, I vote yes.
On behalf of my father, James Kane, I vote yes.
I vote in favor of my grandfather, also William Downey, yes. On behalf of James Good and Darby Good, our grandfather and great-uncle, we all vote yes. Michael Patrick Murphy and his grandchildren here today, we vote yes as an entire family. On behalf of my grandfather, Thomas Joseph Fallon, we vote yes.
ballots have been counted. A total of 1,137 men have voted, and the count is 1,134 votes of yes, 2 votes of no, and 1 blank ballot. And so, brothers, unless Commissioner Curtis rescinds his order this evening, September 9th, at the 5:45 roll call, every union member will turn in his badge and gun at his station and come to this hall immediately after. We do not take these steps lightly. We stand together throughout whatever comes. Godspeed and God bless our union.
On September 9th, over 1,000 police officers went out on strike. They sought recognition for their trade union and improvement in wages and working conditions. These are some of the Boston police officers who made that fateful decision to strike. The 1919 attempt by police officers to form a union, the strike and the aftermath, was a pivotal event in the city of Boston. Today, in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the strike, we reclaim the memories and the stories of these courageous men.
Hello, I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm the records manager and archivist for the Boston Police Department. My job involves very mundane daily records, but the bit of history we have left is with me. And in the 11 years I've been there, I've received more questions about was my grandfather a striker, what happened, than about any other question. This is a centennial, and it seemed a good time to learn more about it. I want to welcome all of you, families of strikers and Boston police officers, both serving and retired. Whether by blood or by badge, you are the heirs to the legacy of the men of 1919. Thank you to the researchers, the genealogists, the UMass students, and the staff and striker descendants, and others who have made the story of individual strikers permanently available to families, students, and researchers. Theodore Roosevelt, who died in 1919 and once served as New York's police commissioner, said, "This country will not be a permanently good place for any of us to live in unless we make it a reasonably good place for all of us to live in." The police officers in Boston in 1919 were asking for very modest working conditions and salary. Their wages had been frozen for years, and the hyperinflation that happened during the Great War had cut their buying power in half. They worked 89 to 90 hours per week, and they were never paid for overtime. The Boston police were often called upon to monitor strikes in other sectors. In 1919, a quarter of the police department was detailed to the elevated railway employees, or the Carmen's Union strike. In the summer of 1912, the police had performed more than 19,000 extra duty shifts for the Boston Elevated Railway strike. Ironically, many of the younger police officers had worked for the L before becoming Boston police officers. They thought that was security and a better pay, but over time that didn't prove to be the case. There were strikes by telephone workers and marine firemen, and even strikes in Lowell and Lawrence, and sometimes the Boston police had to go there. And they would watch these workers get rights and get pay increases while they had none. The best known strike of the era was the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence in 1912. And those strikers, which included many women workers and many immigrants, declared that they wanted not just a pay increase, bread, but they also wanted basic respect, roses. And the Boston police felt the same. I chose this picture because the Bread and Roses strikers are marching with the American flag. It was very popular in 1919 in some circles to equate the labor movement with the anarchist movement, which was also active in 1919. But they were quite different. These workers carried the United States flag as their banner. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr., would compare the striking police officers to the Soviets in Russia. This is a list from the records of the Boston Police Commissioner for 1918, and it goes on into 1919, showing the Boston police officers who had taken leave to go to Europe and fight in the Great War, and now they were being signed back into the department. I looked them up, and everyone on this list was among the strikers in September. At the bottom, you will see the name John F. McGinnis, who in middle age, well into his 40s, left his wife and family and his job with the police department to report for active duty, his 4th time serving in the Army. This is McGinnis, showing him both as a soldier and as the leader of the Boston Social Club and eventually the Union movement. And I think you can see how resolute he was in this photograph. The approximate decision of everyone to go on strike was because McGinnis and the other leaders were about to be fired. I've gotten to look at the McGinnis family papers. His grandson was kind enough to show them to me. And he said, he wrote as he was dying, which was only a few years after the strike, "Always place a flag on my grave on Decoration Day, Memorial Day. That's all Pa wants." A few years ago, I found this grave in bad shape, and the Boston Police Relief Association had it cleaned, had a base made, and added his years of death. And indeed, he is remembered every Memorial Day. Just a few yards away, actually, is Superintendent Crowley, who was the superintendent during the strike. So this is the actual order showing that they were going to fire John McGinnis. And there's one for each of the 19 leaders in the records of the police commissioner. This shows them walking out that fateful night. They were taking their equipment with them because they owned the equipment. They had had to buy it at several $100s a piece, which was a lot of money in 1919. At the end of 1918, Boston mourned the sudden death of Police Commissioner Stephen O'Meara. He had built the Boston Police Department over a dozen years to be one of the most respected in the country. O'Meara promoted on merit, not politics, and he would stand up for his officers. O'Meara had promised to seek raises once the war was over. The new commissioner, which was appointed by the governor, a unique law that meant only for Boston was the right to appoint your police commissioner controlled by the State House, not by City Hall. The new commissioner was Edwin Upton Curtis, who had been Boston's youngest mayor in the 19th century and was described as holding a series of lesser jobs ever since. And of course, it was Boston that had to pay the expenses of the police officers. Curtis refused to advocate for a pay increase for the police, saying the city could not afford it. But just days after the strike, September 16th, a week after the strike, you can see the commissioner's order giving an immediate raise to all the replacement people who took the jobs of the strikers. The money was there. The police strike of 1919 was the making of a president and the unmaking of many Boston families. More than 1,100 men were suddenly searching for work in a city that was transitioning from a war economy to a peace economy, and just as thousands of returning war veterans were arriving in Boston. There is a different story for every family. Some families became quite desperate. The 1920 census shows the children of one striker scattered between various relatives. Another appeared on the books of a social service agency, needing help to meet the most basic needs. One striker, with 5 children, used an alias to obtain work at Jordan Marsh. After several years, his secret was discovered. Management gave him his walking papers and said that he had some moxie to take a job at Jordan's, since so many windows had been broken during the strike. The grandson of another striker was blacklisted, could find no work, and his one striker who was blacklisted found no work, and his grandson told me that his dad, the 14-year-old son of the striker, had to quit school at age 14 to go work full-time at the A&P market. By missing high school, this young man himself was less able to support his own family when he grew up and had a family. So the economic hardship went on to the next generation in some cases. The grandson of social club leader John McGinnis told me that before the strike, there was money for the little niceties, like piano lessons for the girls, but things were quite grim afterwards. Politicians would curry favor with the fired police officers, saying that they would reinstate them if ever they were elected. But of course, the Boston Police Department was managed by the governor, not the mayor or city council. By the time James Michael Curley was elected governor in the 1930s, replacing the new officers with the former officers would have meant firing younger men who were war veterans and replacing them with older men who had been away from policing for many years. It never happened. Once they realized they would never work again as Boston police officers, some strikers found work in police departments in other towns. They were already well-trained and very experienced. But this meant relocating their families permanently away from Boston and away from their extended families. Many flourished in their new positions, and at least a dozen of them became chiefs of police in their new departments, from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Los Angeles, California. A number of strikers became prohibition agents after the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920. At least 3 ended up as guards at Charlestown State Prison, including Walter Doucette, shown here, who was shot and killed by escaping inmates on Christmas Eve, 1935. Some strikers who wished to remain in Boston sought other city jobs over the years. For many years, the strikers were prevented by law from sitting for civil service exams. Several dozen strikers had previously been Boston firefighters, joining the force in 1908 when the Boston Police Department started to give them 1 day off in 15. And a few went back to the fire department and worked their way up through the ranks. They had already taken the civil service exam, so they could go back. While the strikers were all men, the women and the families played their part. A few weeks after the strike, close to 2,000 women who were related to the strikers gathered at the Commons Union Hall to strategize. This is Fay Hall. It's above J.J. Foley's pub in the South End. The Salvation Army provided refreshments to the 2,000 women. In 1921, when the Boston Police Department appointed its first women officers, 6 women, it turned out 2 of the 6 were wives of strikers. This is just 2 years after the strike. The police, I found this document, the police who did the background checks were asked to provide an explanation for this. They were not the crackerjack investigators we have today. Here is Margaret McHugh of Brighton. She had been a supervisor with a telephone company. And then Agnes Callahan, then of East Boston, had been a librarian before having children. Both women worked for more than 30 years with the Boston Police Department. And it was a good thing that Agnes Callahan had a job because her husband died just a year or 2 after she took it, and she had 2 small children to support. In the 1940s and 50s, there was an organization formed called the Boston Police Wives Association. Their papers are at Northeastern University, and I went to visit them one vacation day, and yes, there were newsletters and invitations to teas, and then I noticed there were pictures of them with the governor and the cardinal and the mayor, and I didn't understand what was happening. And it turned out that they were lobbyists. There was no police union, and so the wives formed an association to lobby for legislation that would advance the working conditions of the Boston police officers. When they had the annual ball, the mayor came and the governor signed the legislation with the wives at his side. They asked for full pay for a certain number of sick days. The rest of the city workers could get paid sick days, and the police could only half days. They asked for more money to be paid to line of duty widows. They were getting $300 a year at the time, which, you know, the officers were making about $1,500. Several leaders of the strike ran for office shortly after 1919. In the the front row on the left is George Ferreira, and he ran for city council but was not successful. Hugh Garrity was elected to the Labor Committee. Representative Garrity introduced such bills as an act to increase the minimum and maximum workmen's compensation paid to injured employees, or an act to provide sick pay to injured workers and mechanics employed by the city of Boston, or an act regulating promotions in civil service, saying that the higher scored person should get it, not the commissioner's favorite. Garrity later became a court officer at what is now known as the Adams Courthouse and was then called the Old Courthouse, or we knew it as the Old Courthouse, which is the building behind them, I believe. If living well is the best revenge, I would ask you to consider Patrolman John Rooney of Dorchester's Division 11. After the strike, he went to medical school and opened a medical practice across the street from his old station on Dodd Ave. He would often respond to sudden deaths at the request of the new police. Some officers eventually started their own business. Today, in 2019, a real estate ad notes for a Dorchester home, a Driscoll-built home is a Dorchester classic. Features include hardwoods, china cabinet, chair rails, crown molding, fireplace, all the classic Driscoll amenities, and ready for you. So 100 years after the strike, the good work that William Driscoll did lives on, at high prices, I might add. Festus Madden was from the Kaner region of County Galway, and he was a long-distance runner before joining the Boston Police Department. Festus won the Brockton Half Marathon and placed as well as second in the Boston Marathon. And he might have represented the United States in the 1920 Olympics, but it was discovered he had never quite finished his naturalization papers and had not become a U.S. citizen. How he became a police officer without citizenship, I do not know. Dan O'Neill of Division 15 here, Division 16 in the Back Bay, was a bachelor when he lost his job. Dan went into the insurance business and at age 40 married a much younger woman. They were blessed with 12 children. The middle 10 were girls. Now, Bostonians of a certain age will remember the O'Neill sisters of Jamaica Plain, who led the Easter parade down Commonwealth Avenue every year. Mrs. O'Neill, a talented seamstress, made their 10 matching outfits herself. The O'Neill sisters appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and in Life magazine, and we are happy to have the descendants of Dan O'Neill and Julia with us today. Several strikers have prominent descendants or notable kin, as we mark them in the database. And perhaps the most prominent is former Irish President Mary McAleese, who was the grandniece of Patrolman John H. McCullough, originally from Belfast. Young officers in 1919 were more likely to go on strike than older officers, perhaps because the older officers were worried about their pension. Patrolman McCullough had every reason not to strike. He had been widowed with young daughters at a young age, and he had to put them in care. The family was broken up. When his daughters were a bit older, he was able to hire a housekeeper and brought his girls home. Eventually, he married the housekeeper, Catherine, and had another large family. With all those children to support, from high school down to diapers, Patrolman McCullough took a stand. And after the strike, he worked as a bank guard. But on his death certificate, it recorded that he was a retired Boston police officer. It was President Mary McAleese who mentioned her connection to a striker when she visited Boston about 10 years ago. So the story is continued in Ireland. This is Timothy Curtin, originally from County Kerry, who was among the strikers, had been a carman first, and with him is his son, George Kurt Curtin, whom we're happy to welcome today, wearing his dad's hat. Kurt Curtin called me after the 90th anniversary in 2009, saying he had something I had to see. So I drove to foreign parts out to Worcester to look at his book. Tim Curtin was the secretary of the Boston Social Club. The social club kept meeting for years after the strike. Initially, they were trying to get their jobs back. Then it became an annual get-together that have a mass and a picnic, bring the family. Eventually, it became, it was monthly meetings, but it would also be an annual mass in memory of the departed members. And Kurt Curtin had the book, the records of the social club from 1939 to 1969. These are now digitized and they'll be part of our database. You can see the record here. We hope you all read script, which is hard for the young ones. And this is page after page, the ledger of what they were doing. You would pay your dues by the station to which you were assigned. So when they were listing who was who, they'd say, you know, Division 9, Roxbury, Dudley Street, and then they'd list all those members. So if you're ever going through and looking for your ancestor, check their duty card to see what was the station they were assigned to in 1919. That's how the records were kept. At one point, there was something very touching. One of the strikers, now an older man, said, I have an extra apartment, a living space in my house, and I would like to help some striker who now in his old age may have fallen on hard times. So they really had a devotion to each other. And this was from the Secretary of State's office, what gave their charter. And then you can see the membership cards they had going right up into the 50s with the badge and the shaking hands there. It says they met at Winslow Hall, Warren Street. They would meet at a series of halls in Dudley Square, often Hibernian Hall, Palladian Hall, things there. This is the invitation to their 30th anniversary celebration. UMass Boston didn't exist in 1949, so they had to rent a hall in Dudley Square. And for $3.50, you could come. There would be a turkey dinner, and there was dancing till the wee hours. In our 1,142 names, there are 31 Sullivans. I'm a Sullivan. I'm not related to any of them. And a few weeks ago, I got a call from a descendant of one of the Sullivans, and I said, let me see what else we can find on this one. Coleman Sullivan, you can see from the cards, it was assigned first to Division 7, then to 18, which is all the way out in Hyde Park. I don't know who was mad at him for that, but he got transferred out there. And then to Division 1, which was downtown and much easier to get to. But he was from a large family in rural Galway. And shortly after Easter in 1900, he sailed directly from Galway to Boston on this ship, the SS Hibernian. There were about 12 ships named the Hibernian. A better genealogist than me found the right one. And when he arrived in Boston, the record shows, he noted that he was going to his brother's house on C Street in South Boston and that he had $2.50 in his pocket. A few years later, he married the lovely Annie Eulalie Connolly in Maine and settled in Boston with a new job as a police officer. The newspapers show that he rescued people from burning buildings. Here is Coleman Sullivan profiled in a big story after wrestling with an armed man who was intent on killing his boss, who had just fired him in the North End. Even when he disarmed the man and kicked the gun away, knowing that Patrolman Sullivan was armed, the man continued to resist and to fight him. But Patrolman Sullivan won the day. Coleman Sullivan was active in his local parish in South Boston, and he attended many dances with the Galway Society. And I think he must have been a kind man, because it noted at each of these dances that Coleman Sullivan was in charge of the elderly people's dancing. So I think he must have been nice to the widows and been a good person to do that. Interestingly, the station house where the descendant works today was in service in 1919. So what now is the legacy of these strikers? James T. Kane returned to work as a stonecutter, which was his profession before the strike, and he died still cutting stone at age 81. And at that time, he was the secretary of the Boston local of the Journeyman Stonecutters Association of North America. The son of striker Tim Curtin taught at Westfield State and was involved in starting the faculty union in the 1970s. The granddaughter of John Rooney became a nurse and organized nurses in the 80s at Old Boston City Hospital. The grandson of James Gillespie was head of his police union. And today, 2019, Christina Lett, the great-granddaughter of William Lett, is out in California working for Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare conglomerate which is trying to cut the health care of its employees. So the beat goes on. Will Rogers said, "We can't all be heroes because somebody has to sit on the curb and clap as they go by." So today, and on Monday, September 9th, the actual centennial, and perhaps every day, we should applaud those heroes who sacrificed to give their families a better life and each of us a better Boston. Thank you.
I first learned of Martin Cosgrove being a Boston police officer around the 7th or 8th grade of grammar school when I was studying the Boston police strike, and I came home and discussed it with my mother, who said my grandfather was a Boston patrol officer. I never heard my grandfather discuss being a patrol officer. I never heard my family discuss it. And I really was upset when they stamped his card, abandoned his duty. I never knew my grandfather, Martin Cosgrove, to abandon anything. He never walked out on a job. He never walked out on his family. He was a tough Irishman that would see things through. After the strike, and he could not get his job back, he started a milk company in Dorchester, Cosgrove's Milk. He started with one horse and wagon. He built his business up to about 12 or 13 home delivery trucks. And he became a true success story. He probably had a much better life with his company and providing for many men. My grandfather Martin is my hero.
I am one of 13 grandchildren of Patrick F. Grant, one of the strikers in 1919. And he often spoke to us kids in the 50s as we were growing up that he would patrol the district around Columbus Ave, Nealon Street area. He spoke of how much he loved the people that he met in that Nealon Street area, how hardworking they were. And his other district that he spoke about was Franklin Street. He was on duty the night of the great molasses flood, and that was probably one of the, if not the most significant event of his career. He spoke of how they ran toward the flood. According to him, they were able to save quite a few people. Nearly lost their own lives, some of the men and the patrolmen that were helping. However, he never got over the Boston police strike and how much it hurt him to lose his job. He was angry still in the 1950s and resentful. One of the big things I remember from our childhood was the communion breakfast that used to be held, and I believe it was the Boston Police Benevolent Association, and it was their big communion breakfast, and it was a big deal. And so every year we went to that, and that was one of my childhood memories. He had a good life. He was a good man. He was a great grandfather. I think he was a man of great honor and principled convictions. He was tall, he was handsome, and he was a man who expressed his political opinions liberally.
The meetings were very beneficial to me and to my family to get some closure and some idea of who the man was that none of us really had the fortune of knowing, but kind of a godsend to me to find out gaps in his life that I was never really aware of or that the people who could give me that kind of information were never around as they had passed on. And in a lot of cases, they didn't want to talk about some of this stuff because I think it was very painful to them. At the time he went out on strike, he had 2 children under the age of 3 years old, and his wife was pregnant. So it took a lot of gall, really, to go out and do something like this, to strike. He was a person that was heavily into workers' rights at a time when it wasn't fashionable. And I think in the case of the Boston police strike, he certainly paid the price for his views. Post-strike, I found out how he survived. I heard when the strike happened, he sold his uniform on the street. He did not have the stability that he had on the Boston police force, but the lack of money during the 30s, the Depression, it was not a particularly great time. This project is a dedication not only to us, but to them and my grandparents.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Riley, and I am the interim dean of libraries here at UMass Boston. And I cannot tell you how exciting it is to have you all here today. This project is the outcome of a process that began 7 years ago when Margaret Sullivan, whom you now all know as the archivist of the Boston Police Department, came to us at UMass Boston with this intriguing box of index cards that she told me was filled with the duty cards of all of the men who took part in the Boston police strike, and that in fact they were the only documentation of all of those men that existed. Each card includes the name, work history, division, employment dates of each man who was part of the strike. So Margaret had a proposal to make. She wanted to know if it might be possible for UMass Boston and the Boston Police Department to collaborate on a research project to find out who these men were and what happened to them after the strike. So we thought about that, and really a project like that is right up our alley, because UMass Boston is a public research university, Boston's only public research university, and this project had it all. It was about Boston history. It was about working people who were fighting for social justice. It was a project that would involve the community. It would be a combination of the community of UMass Boston, the faculty, students, and staff, and the wider community joined together to do a rigorous research project together. And then finally, if it were done right, if it were done successfully, it would end up creating new knowledge. It would be a research resource that would be of value to scholars, to students, to teachers, to family historians for many years to come. So it was a definitely enthusiastic yes that we said, yes, let's do this. And of course, 2019 at that point seemed really far away, so it all seemed possible. So the first step was clearly to digitize all of the duty cards and to transcribe every line from every card into the computer. And that was taken care of thanks to some volunteers from the Irish Ancestral Research Association, TIARA, who jumped right in and made that happen. So the results of their work became what we have come to call that's the first plank of the research edifice that we're trying to build. So that's the information from the duty card, and that's a fundamental piece of information. It's really all we had to start with. The second step was a little trickier to figure out because we immediately ran into the problem of disambiguation, you know, that thing that crops up in doing biographical research where you're trying to distinguish between different people who share a lot of common characteristics. It can be very hard to do. So, for instance, if you're diving into research James Sullivan, who was a striker in Boston, you've very soon come to realize that there's another James Sullivan who was a policeman, and then another James Sullivan who was a policeman, and then another James Sullivan who was a policeman, not only that, but in the same time period and also went out on strike. not to mention the fact that in Boston at that time, there were 140 other James Sullivans who lived in Boston. So we had to figure out the disambiguation problem. Turned out that the 1919 Boston Employees Directory became a very good resource for this. It included all of the city employees, including policemen, and they were organized in that the policemen were organized by division. And remember from the duty card, we know the division of each officer. So this was a good resource for us. So if we look for James Sullivan, we find him in his division within the employee directory. And then what we try to do is pin. This was kind of the crux of the research process. We try to pin the information that we know from the duty card that was solidly reliable information. We try to pin that information to this new resource and then see what that might show, what other information it might give to us. So let's see what happens here. We can pin this to his division. We can pin it to his name, James Sullivan, and we can pin it to his employment history, which those dates exactly match his duty card. So we know that we have the right man. And once we have the right man, we know that we can add whatever information is in this resource, we can also attach to that man. And in this case, yay, we get his address, his street address in 1919, which is a useful piece of information. So now we have a second plank of reliable information here. And these two planks are what we refer to as the starting planks. We pre-filled these for the researchers. We created a worksheet for every single one of the 1,142 of the strikers, and each worksheet had their name, their division, a link to their duty card, and these first two planks of information. And then it was to the job of the researcher to fill in the other 14 planks of the worksheet. And they were information like the World War I and II draft information, census records from 1910, 20, 30, and 40, birth, marriage, death records, and a variety of other pieces of information that we wanted to collect as data points to fill out the story of each one of these men, finding out who they were and what became of them after the strike. So I would like to show you one more plank. This is usually the first stop for the researchers after they got those first pre-filled planks. It's the World War I draft registration form. And again, processes again to try to pin information from what we know for sure to this new resource to see then what we can add to our stash of data points. So if we try that here, we can pin his name. We can pin his address, because now we know that, Murdoch Street, we know that from the municipal directory. And we can pin the fact that he was a police officer, right? This proves that he is the man. This is the right person. And once we know that, that opens up the fact that we now can know his middle name was Joseph, his birth date, which is a hugely important piece of information to try to move forward in researching him, the fact that he was an immigrant, he was a naturalized citizen, and his wife's name was May Elizabeth. We also got the bonus of seeing his own signature, and the fact that the registrar who took his record noted that he was tall and stout with blue eyes and black hair. So that gives us our third plank for the worksheet. And over the years of this project, our volunteers have submitted a worksheet for every single one of the 1,142 strikers. And each plank is reviewed by another volunteer and finalized, and each person types in a different color ink, font on the computer. And so the worksheet ends up looking like that. It's a real working document that is collected over time, the information about these people, because it can get very complicated, and things are not. For instance, the World War I draft registration was only for men who were born after 1872. So anyone before that didn't have a draft registration form, and that meant that they had to take another avenue to try to figure out who they were. So the finalized data then is added into our master database, okay? That's the main place where everything is held. And then we have a brief biographical profile that our volunteers are writing up for each of the strikers. That's drawn from the data, and it's kind of a summary of the data. That's not the same as some biographical essays that descendants have contributed to this project, really beautiful, moving essays about their ancestor, and those also are wrapped into the project in a different part of the data system. So that's a lot of moving parts, but it's well worth it for us to get a reliable portrait of each one of these strikers. This is a bit about our progress. Really, the only thing to take away from that is that we're getting there. We're getting there. We have about 30% of the strikers completely entered into the system, and that means 2/3 left to go. It is happening, and it's been an amazing effort on the part of this stalwart group of volunteers. These are the people who have put in the prodigious effort to make this possible. They are people who are interested in genealogy and research in local history, in police history. They are retired police officers, UMass Boston faculty, students, and staff. Some were descendants of strikers. All were dedicated, patient, cheerful, and incredibly productive. It has been such a joy to work with them. And we wanted to welcome everyone into this process who was interested. So, people came from a lot of different backgrounds and levels of expertise and experience with research, with genealogy, with primary sources. And so we created an online training course that's open to the world, it's open to the public, about how to do biographical research using our Planck process, our patented Planck process, and having the experience of trying things out. And we had 198 people worldwide have signed up for that course, and more than 30 of them moved right on to become volunteers with this project. So another major goal of the project is that we wanted to find a picture of every single striker, photograph of every single striker, preferably a portrait photo. And descendants have come forward, have come through with photos and stories, which are a huge contribution to the project. And then we also found a great published source in the 1901 Boston yearbook for the Boston Police Department for every active police officer at that time. So there are photos of them, including, guess who? James Joseph Sullivan of Murdoch Street, we know, in Brighton. Mm-hmm. And then we lucked into an incredibly wonderful resource of Boston Fire Department personnel photos that came to us courtesy of retired Commissioner Paul Christian, who was able to match up those who started out in the fire department and then transferred to the police department and then subsequently went out on strike. So those are, they're beautiful photos, and we have those for several dozen or more perhaps of the officers. So this is very much a project about stories, for sure. And as a research university, UMass Boston is really proud to have contributed a dimension that has to do with the stories that only data can tell. So that might look like a very drab and maybe boring screen, but in fact, if you take information and you aggregate information for a lot of people, you can ask questions of that data and you can receive answers from that data that you absolutely could not know otherwise. For instance, it might come to mind how many of the strikers were immigrants. And that is something that the data can answer. Now remember, we're only working now with a 30% sample, right? Because that's all we have in the master database, more being added regularly. But of that sample, which is a pretty good sample size, it turns out, excuse me, it turns out that 38% of the strikers were immigrants. And of the, no, not of those, 25% of the strikers were born in Ireland, 7% of them were born in Canada, and the remaining 6% from other interesting countries like Italy, Sweden, Russia, etc. So this becomes something that we can know because we have that aggregated data. Based on that 30% sample, what else can we know? In 1919, the year of the strike, of our sample, the average striker was 38 years old, married, and had 2.16 children. The oldest of the strikers was William Ford, who was 60 years old. He was born in 1859. The youngest of the strikers were 4 26-year-olds. And those who survived the longest were 3 who died in 1984, including Jeremiah Sullivan, who is here celebrating his 99th birthday. But I do want to let everyone know that the entire database is not made up of Sullivans. There are definitely other names in there. There's more to it than that. So this is really just the beginning. Future questions and answers that can come up. We'll be able to refine the questions we've been asking to date. We'll be able to ask new questions that are only really limited by our imagination. There are so many things that are left to know. We could find out what the most common occupation was that strikers followed after the strike. We could figure out what percentage of them owned their homes before the strike, and then in subsequent censuses are renting homes, which means that they had some difficulty in maintaining their home, possibly because of the strike. How many left the Boston area? How many served in the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the questions that only data can answer. And it becomes part of our seeking to find out who these men were and what became of them after the strike. So a question that is of interest possibly to the people who have gathered here today is really an estimate how many strikers, how many descendants might there be of strikers at this point. And if we use 2.16 as the average number of children, which is the number that came out from our calculations, then it turns out there are about 20,000 descendants of strikers. And we are so honored that actually literally several hundred descendants of strikers are here today. Mapping data is also another way to find out about who these men were and what became of them after the strike. This is a map pinned from the data, generated from the data, of their addresses in 1919. This is where they lived, and the colors are based on the neighborhood that they lived in. And of course, they all lived in Boston because they were Boston policemen and they needed to live in the city. But 1930, if you apply the data, generate a map from the data in 1930, there's a dispersal that's gone on. And it remains to be seen whether that's a sort of natural migration or if it's was a diaspora that happened in the aftermath of the strike. And once we have all the data in there, we'll be able to really look at that. And all of these questions are the topics for research and, excuse me, subjects perhaps of future master's theses and dissertations to use this data pool to find out the answers to some really interesting questions. So there you have it. 7 years after Margaret Sullivan came to UMass Boston with a box of index cards and a really, really interesting proposal, and 100 years after the Boston police strike itself, I'm delighted to announce that we have launched today, based on the work of so many, a public website that includes all of the work that we have done and will continue to grow based on the work that continues to be done. It's at www.bpstrike1919.org, and it includes a really interesting timeline of the strike, an interactive timeline, and a mapping application that were put together by our public history team here at UMass Boston from within the archives, Carolyn Goldstein from our history department, Jane Becker, and the history students, the graduate students in our history programs in public history and archives. The website also offers a gateway into all of the research, the data that we've been gathering. You can search here for an individual. You can search for a group, everyone who was from Dorchester, or everyone who was born in Sweden, or everyone who worked in Division II. And you'll see the results coming up. And if you click on the photograph, you'll get to see the photograph. If you click on the duty card, you'll be able to see the duty card, which is in there for every single officer. And then if you click on this that says stories and photos, you'll see everything contributed to the project by family members and others about that particular striker. We called this site roll call. By definition, a roll call is, quote, a process of calling out names to establish who is present. That's what we're trying to do. We want each man who participated in the strike, who took the step to unionize, to gain fair wages and decent working conditions, to be present and accounted for. And so what's next? We invite you to visit the website, of course, to explore the rich material there, knowing that we still have 2/3 of the data to plow into the master database, and to provide us with feedback, with new stories, new photographs, and to help us in correcting any mistakes or omissions. All of that is possible through the website. So thank you for being here today, And we want to thank especially the volunteers who have put their heart and souls into this project. We thought you might like to hear from a few of them, and we wish you could hear from every single one of them. But we do have a video compilation, and this was put together by another of the volunteers, Susan Geddes Epling, and I hope you really enjoy it. Thank you.
What we're doing in this project is really a storytelling project. I like to think of it as we're recreating the histories, the stories of these men, because all we really knew about the men who went on strike are these little 3x5-inch index cards. All we had there was their surname and given name, and that's it. They did a lot in terms of the history of the Boston area, and I like to think, especially because my grandfather was a striker, that we're honoring those men.
We always know a lot about union leaders and the general structures of union activities and strikes, but to find out about how a strike affected an individual person is something that we don't always hear about. What I found is that as I spent hours researching an individual striker, by the end I felt like I was related to this person. And it was actually a family member, even though I have no family members involved in the strike and I'm not from Boston.
I'm a volunteer with this program. I'm also a retired Boston police officer after 36 years. It's through this program that I found out that I had two granduncles, Richard Murphy from Jamaica Plain and Thomas Martin Igo. It was through this program that I found out what they did and how they did not cross the picket line. I'm very proud of them. I've met Richard Murphy many times. One time when I was in uniform, but he never mentioned to me that he was a striker. And it's through this program I'm finding more information and background on him.
Having been born in Boston, Brighton specifically, I was aware of the 1919 Boston police strike and its role in catapulting Calvin Coolidge to the presidency eventually. But until about 3 years ago, I had no idea that I had a personal connection to it. Uncle Jim was my father's uncle. And I knew nothing about this before. And then when this project came up, I just jumped at the chance to learn more about the whole thing. It's been a marvelous experience working with this team at UMass Boston.
My favorite story is a story about Richard Gillerin. This story is really about family and his relationship to family. He and his 8 brothers and sisters were orphaned when he was a young teenager. His sister Kathleen, who was the second oldest in the family, emigrated to the United States. She worked as a domestic servant, and she saved her money and brought each of her siblings over one at a time. If you look at their shipboard records, it asks the question, who paid for your passage? And each one of them said, my sister Kathleen. I have this vision of her in her garret housing in a wealthy house on Beacon Hill, saving her money in a little coffee tin, and then being down at the dockside waving to her next incoming brother or sister. Richard Gillerin and his remaining siblings all stayed here and became active members of the Boston community.
I love pouring through old newspapers and other sources, uncovering details beyond the basics of the lives of people whose stories are not often told. And there were a good many stories to find about the strikers before, during, and after their time in the police force. Take, for example, John W. Forbes, who helped redirect a group of wayward Jamaica Plain boys by organizing them into a baseball team. Or William McDonald, who in 1919 stopped a mentally disturbed man from shooting President Woodrow Wilson at the Copley Plaza. He'd managed an H.B. Hood store in Salem before joining the force, and went on to a long post-strike career in the grocery business, rising from store manager to vice president of the A&P chain in New England. Or James Clark, who was shot and nearly killed while operating undercover against the Black Hand extortion ring in 1911, and fought unsuccessfully for years after the strike to be reinstated in light of the sacrifice he had made. These stories, and those of others like them, help bring these men out from the shadows, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to bring them to light.
Given the collective and comradely spirit of the Boston police strike, we like to think that the officers who took part in the strike would be really honored and pleased by the collaborative spirit and the teamwork of so many who have worked and continue to work to document their lives and commemorate their struggle. In that spirit, we'd like to invite all of the volunteers who worked on the research project who are here today to please stand or wave so that we can acknowledge you.
We'd also like to thank the families who have either kept the story alive through the generations, or in some cases are still learning about things that perhaps the family didn't talk about. We have people from as far away as California. We have people who are in their 90s who are children of strikers. Could the families either stand or wave and be recognized?
And I would like to thank and really acknowledge the core project staff who are at the heart of this through UMass Boston's Healy Library and the Boston City Archives. They held things together. So much of what you see and are going to see in terms of this project comes from their amazing expertise and their commitment to local history, public history, and to documentation, primary documentation. So if I could ask them to stand. Patty Brudemesso, is Patty here? Where's Patty? Yes, holding it on. Caroline Littlewood. Where's Caroline? Caroline is here. And Kayla Skillens. Where's Kayla Skillens from the Boston City Archives? Andrew Elder, also from the Healy Library. Carolyn Goldstein from the Healy Library. Carolyn. Jessica Holden from the Healy Library. Yay, Jessica. Sarah Collins, our voice from the Healy Library. Megan Bailey. Brenda O'Brien, a graduate student. Mary Moser. Dina DePardo. There's Dina. Christine Malpica and Nina Rodwin from UMass Boston. Right,
This day was made even better by our sponsors, who made it a comfortable day, provided catering, the buses, helped with the website. We want to thank our major donors, Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, especially President Mike Leary and Treasurer Bobby Colburn, the City of Boston Credit Union, Brenda and Tom O'Brien, Robert Bayard Severy, the Zapata Zafira Library Fund, and also the Detectives Benevolent Society, Celeste Finnison, Julianne Fitzgerald, Lieutenant Donna Gavin, Peter Killalay, Teresa McMurrow, the Retired Boston Police Officers Association, Herb Spellman. Thank you so much. I want to introduce the grandson of one of the strikers, who will read to you a city proclamation. This is a day for police and for families, but the City of Boston issued a proclamation recognizing what is happening. And we would like to invite former Congressman Bill Delahunt, grandson of striker Thomas Delahunt, to share a story of his grandfather and read the proclamation. Thank you.
I'm going to take just a few minutes before I read the proclamation by Mayor Walsh. This was very moving. And I feel like I have a big family now. It's not the Sullivans. It's, the Delahunts. And I can see three of my cousins up there. Tom, who voted the right way, yes. Matthew, Michael, and my two daughters, Cara and Kirsten Delahunt. This is spectacular, really. You deserve so much credit for this. I think we all will leave here today enriched by the work that you all did. It really is very, very moving. You know, when you hear the history and you see that stamp on that card that says, abandon his duty, we know better. They were abandoned. They were abandoned by Commissioner Curtis and Calvin Coolidge. I guess maybe that's why I'm a Democrat. And I tell you, we didn't know my grandfather. He died in 1932. I might look that old, but I was born in 1941. But many, many years ago, I had the honor of serving in the state legislature. And there was a bill that was put forward by the Boston Commons Union. Now, you've heard references to them during the course of the past hour. And the bill would have authorized strikes by public employees. That's pretty radical stuff, okay? And this is when the House was 240, the State House, the House of Representatives. And I think there were 7 or 8 of us who voted yes. And Dave Bartley, who some of you may remember, was the speaker at the time. And he looked at me from the speaker's dais and gave me one of these. He said, Delahunt, what are you doing? I said, this is for my grandfather. And I'd vote that way again. Let me read, this is a proclamation by Mayor Walsh, and I'll be brief because I know the day is short and I see that 5:30 is fast approaching. Whereas on September 9th, 1919, more than 1,100 Boston police officers put themselves on the line to fight for recognition of their union, for fair wages and decent working conditions. And whereas the Boston Police Department files claim that each officer abandoned his duty September 9th, 1919, historical records and family members show these men fulfill their duties as soldiers and sailors in the Great War, as law enforcement officers in many cities and towns, as civil servants in various public positions, as business entrepreneurs and workers, and as husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers, setting an inspirational example for later generations. And whereas the aftermath of the strike affected entire families who inherited the legacy of a dramatically influential and controversial event, and who have preserved stories and images of the lives of the strikers for 100 years. And whereas 82 volunteers devoted more than 90,000 hours over 7 years to document the lives of the strikers through meticulous research. And whereas staff from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Healy's Library, and the Boston Police Archives brought together community members, family members, students, retired police officers, and many others to commemorate the lives and stories of the striking officers on the occasion of the centennial, which resulted in the public website that was just referenced, for the benefit of all. Now, therefore, I, Martin J. Walsh, Mayor of the City of Boston, do proclaim to be 1919 Boston Police Strike Project Day in the City of Boston. Thank you.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, I touch with all the radiance that the sudden sun discloses. For the people here are singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead go crying through our singing, their ancient call for bread. No more the drudge and idler tend that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we bring the greater days, the rising of the workers means the rising of us all. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirit new. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too.
Thank you.
So, we'll have to talk about how to get your.
Okay. Yeah, I'm employed through the school.
Say it again?
I'm employed through the school.
Oh, good. That's
so if
gonna
that
help.
helps.
It does. Now, who of your colleagues are here? Did you?
Yeah. That's Liz, Wayne, Holly.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe we'll get something together again.
I'll probably ask them to email you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. That was
Oh my God.
unbelievable.
That was amazing.
It is.
It's
Thank you.